Welcome back, friends. I've been reading a lot more Alfred R. Mele lately, who I initially got into because when I was working on my productivity materials that are still Yam Keto Club exclusive, when I was working on those materials, he wrote an old book, might have been like the 80s, maybe even the 70s, on self-control, on akrasia, which is a classic kind of Greek concept for weakness of will, when we act in a way other than we intended to, or against our best judgment of what we ought to be doing. And his more recent material I was getting into has to do with free will, which is one of these things that occasionally people kind of get into like a deep side interest in and find real interesting. Have a hard time finding people who want to talk about it because it just seems like either it's unanswerable or what's the value in talking about it. Like a lot of philosophy questions can feel a little theoretical to folks. But I've taken a special interest because obviously when my focus here is on helping you do what you want to do, there is already baked into that an assumption that you are able to do something other than what you're on track to do. And there's a bunch of nitty gritty. Obviously, I mean, this is how philosophers will spend huge tomes talking about free will and arguing about it and so on. A couple practical takeaways from that, because that's the lens I like to bring to this sort of thing, making it a little more accessible, thinking about the practical implications. One thought from it is simply this observation that Mele came to, I think it was his book Free, that studies have reflected that when people are believers in free will, that when people subscribe to the idea that they have control over their actions, that when people don't accept that deterministic causes of events lead to the outcomes, if people have been, for example, reading materials that speak about free will, if people have been sort of been exposed to the idea and thinking about it lately, it increases people's sense of responsibility over their own actions. It increases their level of self-control over doing things. It decreases the amount at which they wind up blaming factors outside themselves. And just as an example of this, let's say that there's temptations in your life, and these temptations could range, right? They might just be as simple as whether or not you're going to, I don't know, eat another candy bar when you're coming out of the gas station or something, to something maybe more severe, something in terms of something that would be leading to relationship complications or committing crimes or whatever the range of things are. One of the challenges that happens is that if somebody has been exposed to materials, and I phrase it that way because part of what's weird about this, right, is that it's not necessarily in everybody's control to expose themselves to materials. We'll get to that in a second. If someone's been exposed to materials that free will is a thing, that people can have an outcome based on their thought process, their decision, their conscious choices, they are better able to steer clear of those things rather than what winds up happening otherwise is if what they've been reading, thinking about, talking about are things that suggest that free will doesn't exist, that we are simply products of our environment, that we are merely a chain of events and a part of a pipeline like that, it becomes much easier to give in to those temptations, to do the things by momentum, to act on something because it's there, as opposed to deviating from that path, which takes an additional ounce of willpower, takes an additional conscious trigger of some kind. And the reason why I'm discussing it in this way is that there's almost as a side product of one of the things Mele discusses in his book is some research by Libet, which I think gets way too far into the EEG, brain scan side to stuff. There's questions science can answer. I think this is one that philosophy is better equipped to grapple with, but I appreciate he's trying to confront that detail. But in it, he brings up this idea of free won't. And what I like about the idea of free won't, I'm even kind of borrowing, adapting some materials here to make it a little more practical, is that rather than thinking of it as free will in the sense of I can choose anything from around me, picturing free will instead as a kind of veto power, as an ability to override. And, this doesn't mean it's universal, doesn't mean it's a skeleton key. There's all kinds of other potential factors, ego depletion, like you can be too exhausted to override something. One of the reasons why they put tempting items like candy bars near the checkout lines of stores, because then you're so exhausted from making all these other decisions and saying no to this and saying no to that and saving money on that, and you're exhausted, so you, on the way out, fail to block that action. But, like I say, on this topic of doing what you want to do, kind of the two key points that I come into this with are, one, that exposing yourself to these materials that free will is a thing, that you can do the things you mean to do, that it is in fact up to you, that you are not just having to follow through on momentum, can in itself play a factor in, if nothing else, your ability to exercise that free won't, that deviation from what would have happened otherwise had you not consciously intervened in it and said, I know what I would have done, I've decided what I want to do instead. And that can be a starting point. And the reason I kept phrasing it as if you've been exposed to free will, pro-free will material, as weird as that sounds. Part of what's interesting about this framing of free won't is you can think of it as, you know, you may not have an answer to a question until you've been asked that question, but you can still do things in your life to move yourself towards getting asked certain kinds of questions. Think of it this way, right? I mean, if you attend a school, then you can have a choice of which classes you sign up for the semester. If you didn't put yourself on that track, you don't have that choice. Doesn't make any sense. It's not a meaningful thing. And actually, one other example to go back to this thing about how simply belief in the idea itself has a practical outcome in this way that bizarrely gets tangled up in, then, well, how do I have any control over choosing that to expose myself to it? I'm also reminded of some older research, and I, to be honest, can't remember who the heck to cite for this because it was long ago I read about it. But there's actually this neat effect of, okay, you might have heard that, you know, doing math homework or studying while music's playing helps. You might have heard it distracts you. Turns out that there's studies out there showing both. And my favorite meta-analysis from those is that they literally got control groups and separate groups of people, and you know how scientists do what they do. They exposed some of them to materials that said that music distracts you and makes you less effective at studying. They exposed others to studies that showed that music helps you concentrate, helps you not get distracted, helps you study more effectively. And then, you know, however they did it on their testing results of a reading comprehension or solving math problems, whatever it was they had them doing, sure enough, the people who had been exposed to legitimate material that said music makes studying worse, that had that effect on them. The music distracted them. They knew, and it's kind of like a deep placebo effect almost, of when they expected it to hurt their ability to concentrate, it did. The other group that had been exposed to materials that said that it will help you study, that it will help you keep concentration, again, that group had that effect of the music of, again, maybe it's massive placebo effect, persuading themselves, I'm doing the right thing, I know that this is a good thing that helps me study, right? This is a very bizarre effect that I'm sure ties into all kinds of other little things that we do in our lives. I'm covering a lot today. But yeah, it's threads I've been focusing on in my reading, in my studies, in part because so often what I'm trying to do, that's why I'm on this whole thread in this kind of topic chain to begin with, helping people get to do the things that they want to do, is recognizing where in there someone is not doing the thing because they don't feel able, perhaps, and that there's a different barrier there. And this is something where they may have, it's not a resource question, it's not actually a time question, it might be some other thing. And granted, there's obviously, there's physical circumstances, there are very real reality circumstances. If somebody is, I don't know, in prison, just as a extreme example, without access to a computer or the internet or something, and granted I have no idea what prison circumstances are like a media depictions like the rest of y'all, obviously they could be completely objectively constrained by their reality, by their limitations, to not be able to do certain things. For many other folks out there, though, that's not what's holding them back. It's not a physical lack of access, part of what's great about the internet. It's not a lack of access to the information. The information's out there, but that they're not using it means, you know, lots of these questions to attack about. Why not? When they know, by their best judgment, it's what would make them happier, it's what they want to have done, and so on and so forth. So anyway, been thinking about this stuff more as I'm going to be preparing an update, a change for that internal facing, what I used to call here, getyourselftodothings.com stuff. Still there if you're curious. But in the next iteration of that, that's going to be more public facing. Been thinking about this kind of stuff. That's it for the day. Thanks as always for hanging out, chatting, listening, as I continue to explore these topics about, in this case, helping get you to do the things that you want to do. I'll see you tomorrow.